Stanford and Adobe, and was received an honorable mention award in the best of Kai competition, which means you have a whole stack of certificates.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm going to be presenting a project called Motif, where we explored how to use storytelling patterns from expert examples to better support novices in creating their own video stories. Telling stories is an essential part of how human beings reflect on their lives and share experiences with others. As a result, we often desire to document these stories that we make in some way, and the popularity of mobile phones and other devices have made it easier to create photos, videos, and other types of digital media that can accompany the stories that we tell around our lives. However, it can be really hard to even know what kinds of content to capture. Experienced storytellers might have a skeleton of a story already in mind and may be able to anticipate the sorts of things that they need to capture in order to tell a story later, but the rest of us are less likely to think about the content that we'll need. Even if we know what to capture and have successfully retrieved what we needed, it's difficult to sit down and put it all together. So how can we make this process of story capture and construction easier for novices and make this mess look more like this? Existing story creation tools aimed towards novices sometimes provide templates that a user can insert content into to create something that looks generically good. However, the template approach limits novices to using content that they already have and leave little room for users to express their own ideas or adjust the story according to specific storytelling needs. Other tools like Google Stories and other things focus on quick capture and attractive presentation. And this makes it super easy to create nice looking things out of what you've generated already, but this doesn't really help you create with a story in mind. In contrast, expert storytellers such as scrapbookers and home film junkies actually plan their story's visual content ahead of time to make sure they don't miss chances to capture moments important to the story. But this can be hard for novices who don't have a lot of storytelling experience. So can we instead somehow get the best of both worlds and provide the guidance novices need while enabling the flexibility needed for them to express their own stories? So our goal with Motif was to see if it was possible to support that middle ground, which we explored by creating an Android application called Motif that supports video storytelling for novices based on patterns extracted from expert practice. And this approach was informed by a number of pieces of previous work. First, when creating a new story, expert storytellers think about story construction and story capture at the same time. So rather than being a sort of linear pipeline where you stick stuff in and somehow get a story at the end, storytelling usually involves exploration of ideas through some iteration between these two phases. For example, videographers often think ahead to the editing phase while they're planning the material they need to shoot. And while they're editing, think about the story that they can tell with the material that they have. And they may even go back to capture some more shots if they find that they need to while they edit. Second, we can take inspiration from the idea of pattern languages, which describe a set of well-known practices within some field of expertise. And this is different from a template because patterns are modular and meant to be combined and mixed to create the base for a new thing. So for example, in architecture, an airport gate and a hospital waiting room might both have similar properties in the sense that they can both be places for people to wait. And that's a pattern that can be referred to and altered according to the specific needs of each situation. And this idea is extended to other areas, such as design and programming, to address recurring problems with commonly used solutions. So it might be that storytelling also has common patterns that can be extracted from existing practice and made available for use by novices who are still learning. So in this talk, I'll first talk about how we extracted storytelling patterns used in video stories that were created by experts, then describe the Motif application to show you how these patterns work to enable a tight link between story construction and story capture. And lastly, I'll talk about an evaluation we ran with novice video creators to see whether this pattern-oriented approach affected their creative process and the quality of stories that they made. So to develop our storytelling patterns, we wanted to look at a number of videos created by experts, or at least experienced amateurs, to see if we could identify common patterns between them. And this corpus of videos that we looked at included a number of video stories from the New York Times website, 2 Rick Steves travel videos, and some home videos previously created by one of the researchers, and they covered various topics including food, travel, fashion, and world news. We then performed a grounded analysis to look for groupings of shots that served a clear storytelling purpose, using hints like scene changes to identify when certain parts of the story began and ended. And this is an example of a particular group of shots that had the purpose of introducing a travel location, and how we broke down each of the shots from this sequence. Once we identified and broke down a bunch of these groupings, we consolidated groupings of shots with similar storytelling purposes, as you can see here. In this process, at the end of this process, we ended up with the 24 patterns here. And you'll notice that there are 3 different kinds of colors here. And as part of our patterns generation process, we also considered whether the pattern was used as part of a beginning, a middle, or an end. And this sort of grammar is relatively simple, but nevertheless starts to point to how mixing and matching patterns can allow you to express a variety of different stories, unlike in template-oriented approaches, for example. And just to clarify, these 24 patterns are definitely not meant to be some sort of exhaustive list of all video storytelling patterns ever, but these are just the patterns that we happen to come up with from our limited corpus of examples, and are mostly an example of how storytelling patterns might be generated. So for each of the patterns that we came up with, we also identified the elements that were required to make up that pattern. So here's the example clip sequence from earlier, which was one of the groups of shots that inspired the set the location pattern that we came up with. And this pattern requires a few shots recording narration about the place, as well as a few shots that are sort of a sneak preview for the rest of the video to come. We also noted the time lengths of each element as they appeared in expert examples to create a sort of typical editing timeline for combining these pieces into a video, essentially creating a recipe for what and how much of each ingredient is needed for each pattern, including how they might overlap or otherwise come together to form a scene. So to see how we could use these patterns that we identified in a creative process that iterated between story construction and story capture, we created a mobile video storytelling application called Motif. 2 main user interfaces allowed us to make use of patterns. First, in story construction mode, patterns were manifested in Motif as story blocks. These blocks could be stacked to the user interface to build a story. And they also enforced a simple grammar by requiring every story to have at least one beginning, one middle, and one end. But any number of middle block patterns were allowed to be combined to create a final story. Second, the elements required for each pattern were transformed into prompts for the user, which were listed within each block. So a user could tap on a prompt to fill in that particular part of a story block with a video clip or text. And additionally, these prompts also appeared in capture mode. So at the top of the screen, they would appear to the user as a reminder for what they needed to capture for their eventual story. And the user also didn't have to go back to story construction mode to see what was next. They could simply swipe through prompts and fill in the pieces of each block right from the screen. So in this way, we tried to strike a balance between providing guidance and providing flexibility. Patterns that we derive from expert work act as a guide, not a template, and novices can alter and modify these patterns as the need arises. So we have patterns, and we have a mobile video creator tool that uses these patterns, but we wanted to see if this approach actually improved creative outcomes for novices. So we did this by running a study comparing 2 versions of the Motif application. The full Motif application with the story blocks that I described earlier, and a version of the app without any story blocks or prompts called the control condition. And we recruited 13 participants who were novices in the area of video editing and storytelling for a 1.5-hour task where we asked them to create a short video story about a popular tourist spot in the area. We randomly assigned them to one of the versions of the Motif application and then asked them to walk around to collect video footage. Afterwards, we conducted semi-structured interviews with participants about their experience, focusing on things like what their criteria was for including certain shots, why they made certain storytelling decisions, and the easiest and hardest things about creating their video. And we also wanted to get a sense of the overall quality of the videos. So 2 researchers and 1 video expert independently rated each of the participants' videos according to a rubric of things like story structure, shot coverage, shot composition, and so on. So in the end, we received 7 videos created using the control application and 6 videos created using Motif. And the videos created by participants tended to be fairly short, only a few minutes long. And because we did give participants a list of ideas for places to visit during their video, people tended to visit the same places, but ideas for video stories were surprisingly diverse, ranging from things like a food-focused tour of local businesses, to the story of buying flowers for my partner, to the ghosts of Pike Place Market. And participants, especially those from the Seattle location, actually took the study as an opportunity to purchase items or pass by spots that they personally found interesting, but hadn't had yet a chance to see. So in a sense, participants acted as sort of realistic tourists and had to deal with creating their story while navigating a somewhat unfamiliar area and carrying items that they had bought along the way. So we also found that story blocks help participants use expert examples. Participants in both conditions stated that they had a mental image of expert videos that they had seen in the past that they referred to while trying to create their own video. But in the motif condition, story blocks seemed to help participants translate these examples into a structure for their own video story. So motif participants noted that it seemed to change the way that they recorded their experience, with this participant saying that putting together multiple short clips to convey something would have never occurred to them without story blocks. At the same time, story blocks weren't perfectly suited to every story situation. So some motif participants described interpreting the prompts rather loosely and using story blocks more as a guide for the feeling that a shot should have rather than following instructions to the letter. And so this is an example of one of the motif videos annotated with the story blocks and prompts that they used. And you'll notice that, for example, in this example, they sometimes only filled in one ingredient for a block. Like this introduction here.
This is going to be a tour of several local businesses at Pike Place Market. We'll be going to the creamery, the fish market, and a local deli.
They would also adapt blocks meant for other things for their specific situation. For example, this block asking the viewer to record their surroundings from outside that are outside of a vehicle window as they travel somewhere, but this person chose to use it while they were walking to a new destination.
Right now we are on the way to the fish market.
There's also the fact that they would narrate everything even if the prompt didn't ask for it.
Our first stop is actually going to be a flower market. Looks like the fish market is closed today. We're here at the flower shop. It looks like it goes
So you get the idea.
way down.
So story blocks seem to change the way participants thought about their story, but they viewed it as a resource from which they could take what they needed or ignore if they felt they had better ideas. In contrast, participants in the control condition, like this participant, only really got a sense of the structure that they could have had after the fact, and described feeling awkward and indecisive during the video capture process. And this is one of the videos by the control condition participants who basically took one long video as they narrated their thoughts about a particular point of interest.
Here we are in the Nagini Sculpture Garden. So this is one of my favorite places on campus because the statues are just so unreal. And there's this lovely forest here. So there are all kinds of great trees.
Right. Yes, and it just continues this way. So second, we also found that story blocks help reduce cognitive load during capture. Participants in the motif condition described that being able to put together their story using story blocks prior to and during the capture portion of the task had a payoff while they were trying to walk around and record things. So as this participant said, they could use the story blocks and prompts as sort of a gentle guide, and then just concentrate on capturing and modifying their story as needed. Control participants, in contrast, had to mentally juggle their story idea with judgments about what to capture, making it hard to separate the real-time order of events from the sequence of events that they eventually wanted their story to convey. So this participant found it necessary to write notes to help him remember what he was capturing, as there was no other structure to help him kind of ground the purpose of shots. So we learned a little bit about how story blocks and prompts affected people's story creation process. But what about quality? Were motif videos just overall better than control videos? So for this, we asked our expert evaluator to rank blind to condition all the videos created by participants in order of overall quality, and found that motif videos received significantly higher ranks than videos created using the control application. So Motif sought to create a better way to weave together story construction and capture for novices. Our goal here was not to necessarily provide a one-click solution to creating really attractive-looking video stories, but to take a deeper look at how expert creators engage in creation and figure out how we can design technology that keeps a creative process in mind. And we found that this approach may lead to more powerful and more flexible creativity support tools for novices. We also found that Motif was able to help novices break down expert examples they had seen in the past and use parts of those examples in their own work. Our patterns here focused on story structure in particular, but you can imagine that we could use the same approach of using patterns for other aspects of the creation process. And while we focused on video storytelling in particular, you can imagine being able to use patterns in other domains altogether. Maybe you could build an essay out of writing patterns seen in the New York Times, or compose a song by mixing and matching musical strategies used by your favorite artists. Examples of creative work made by experts are everywhere, and breaking down these examples into accessible patterns could be a good way to extend our power to create and learn. So thanks for listening to my talk. I'd like to thank my advisor and co-authors and everyone else who helped out with the project, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Hi, Peter Darsgaard, Aarhus University. First of all, thank you. It was a beautiful presentation and really inspired a lot of thoughts in my head regarding this. What did the experts think of Motif? Did you try to present it to storytelling experts? And in continuation, can you imagine something in between Motif that is supposed to scaffold this creation process for novice users and something perhaps for intermediate users and then also onto experts? Because I imagine they use different systems that they're very competent with. So once you get like a basic grip of things, what might you need to move towards that expert stage?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So we didn't show Motif to experts, so all of our participants were not experts. I think that would be really interesting to see what they think. And I guess to answer your question about what we need to do to sort of move novices, I guess, to the next stage, I think is what you're asking. That's a really good question. I think we would sort of need to look at how maybe talk to people who are in this intermediate stage and kind of see the strategies that they're using. So here we kind of looked at experts and kind of tried to bring it down to the novice level. But it'd be interesting to kind of use that similar strategy to see what would it take to sort of help move people through these intermediate stages. So that's a really good question. I think that'd be great to look at.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, it's really nice work. So I'm really interested in the patterns. And I mean, generally, so patterns, it's like kind of the types of ideas people have, which are like, that's equivalent to the categories to like flexibility, variety. So I was wondering, for one thing, I don't know if you could reflect a little bit like on the process you used for identifying your patterns and like other processes you could think of using for doing that. And I'm not asking, I'm not bringing this up to criticize what you did, but because I think it's interesting, and also then it becomes interesting to also look at how people, like, you could count the patterns that people use, and also the patterns patterns or types that you have in your tool might or might not exactly correspond to the whole space of types that you could think of. So I just wondered if you could reflect about this a little.
Yeah, that's a good question, and something we've thought about a little bit. So I mean, for us, I mean, we did this manually on a small corpus basically, and that it was sort of a grounded analysis, kind of try to code basically scenes of videos. But I think other things that we could do is maybe one, try to do this on a larger scale to see if we can take advantage of a much larger set of examples, basically, maybe through, I don't know, machine learning or crowdsourcing or something like that, to see if we can get a more variety, I guess, of videos into this kind of process to make available to novices. Yeah, and then I guess the other thing also is maybe looking at different types of patterns as well. Like here in particular, like we looked for patterns regarding story structure in particular, but I imagine you could do a similar process for other aspects, right? Like, for example, in our study, we found that there wasn't a big difference in how well people compose their shots, for example. But if we look for patterns in in expert examples for, when do they use a certain composition or when do they use a certain type of shot. Like that could also be a kind of thing that we could take advantage of.
That sounds really good. I also, it just occurs to me that you could, for whatever size corpus that you use, you could compare that with what, like, people who write, like writing experts, or if you're talking about shots, videography experts, like what they would generate if you asked them about it, and compare those two kinds of data.
Yeah, thank you.
Robert Woodbury from Simon Fraser University. The last question was a perfect, I think, segue into mine. I was delighted by your presentation.
Thank you.
What I'm going to say next is actually a compliment,
okay.
although it may not sound like it. I think that the most beautiful thing for me was that your presentation factored out the sequence aspects so beautifully that it brought into sharp focus the things that can't be captured in sequence, like metonymy, like camera pulls, like the restless camera, the bits of the filmmaker's craft that will not work with the sequence interface but are equally important. So I think you sort of threw down a gauntlet for yourself and others to come up with an equally beautiful design idea to start handling those things.
Yeah, I mean, that's what research is for.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I think you're totally right. Yeah, I mean, this project definitely, I think, opened up a lot of avenues for kind of tackling how creative tools are designed, and I hope to kind of continue looking at that. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you again. The next presentation is also a collaboration between a university and Adobe, in this case, Toronto. So, Peter, I'll let you.
Thanks. So, graphic design is everywhere, from signs to websites to posters.